Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good whatever time that you're listening to this second Devo. Hope that you had an enjoyable time reflecting on the first one yesterday. Um, Maybe you weren't really expecting us to jump right in and begin with confession, but I think, like I said in our introduction, as we seek what God is doing on campus, I think it has to first begin with us. And so the question of like, where are places that we need to confess in order to see God's life appear again, I think is really important. And so, yeah, today during our second devotional, we titled it Faith to Say Yes. And hopefully, as we read this passage, which actually will be another passage related to Jesus and the disciples on the boat with a storm, um, yeah, my hope is that God will speak to us during this time and that it would just be a time where we can reflect more deeply on the truth of God's word. So, Josh, would you like to read this passage? We're reading Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33 today.
Yep. All right. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Um,
Thanks, Josh.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so for as we begin with this passage, just some introduction or background context for this passage is that it says in verse 22 immediately. And so what's happening before this is the passage where Jesus and the disciples feed 5,000. And so in that account, basically what happens is Jesus and the disciples, or Jesus uses the disciples to feed a crowd of 5,000 plus. So 5,000 was a representation of the men in the crowd, but most likely there was also like women and children, so more than 5,000. And they fed everyone with like 5 fish and 12 bread or something like that. So some small number that didn't seem like they'd be able to feed so many people. And in this miracle, Jesus uses the hands and feet of the disciples to actually bring about full abundance for the people. And so, right after this miracle, it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat. Um, and so, yeah, that's kind of the background as we read what's happening in this passage. So, I guess just like yesterday, Josh, do you want to start with sharing what you noticed, or I don't know, what stuck out to you?
Yeah. Um, I guess I had some questions that were kind of I guess confusing to me.
Mm,
I guess there's a lot of points in the Bible where he goes to pray, but it says that he went to pray alone. Right now, I guess in this passage. So I was just wondering why did he go alone? I guess.
yeah.
Maybe it is as you just said, maybe it is because he just wanted some alone time after the 5,000 came to him. Um, or yeah, maybe it was a different reason, but yeah, I don't know. Um, yeah, and I guess just the verse that just stood out to me in the whole thing was let's see, um, Where is it? But when?
Verse 26.
Verse 26. Yes. Oh, yes, I see it. Yeah. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. Um, yeah, I don't know. It was just weird to me because um I feel like I mean the disciples knew Jesus well, and then
Mm,
like I guess they've seen like like they literally just saw a miracle happen, you know. But then when they see just walking in the water, I mean, yeah, I guess it looks like kind of crazy, but I feel like I don't know. I feel like maybe it was weird to me that the disciples didn't recognize him, I guess. And
mhm.
I mean, I guess maybe if we saw anything walk on water, we'd probably like be freaked out. But it was interesting that they were like, "Oh, it's a ghost." Like, like they don't even know the person that they saw.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. That was interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, I agree. Like, my question is like around verse 23 of why did Jesus go to the mountain to pray by himself? It's just like, I think between 22 to 24, it's just really, or I guess all the way, this whole thing with eventually Jesus walking on the water to meet the disciples is just like a very interesting of like a
Hmm.
way that Jesus responds to the miracle. It's kind of like something crazy really happens and then they don't really celebrate or they don't really, I don't know, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of time for the disciples to really process,
Hmm.
or maybe they do on the boat, who knows. But yeah, Jesus asks them to go on the boat and Jesus doesn't go with them, and then he finds himself praying in the mountain, which we don't really know why, or what exactly is he talking to God about. Um, but maybe we can infer that he is talking to God about like the miracle that had just happened, or
Hmm.
just a culmination of a lot of things that led him to want to go to the mountain alone. Um, and yeah, I don't know why he chooses to walk on water. It's like the ease
Yeah.
of just like, oh, I can't get to them fast enough. Or like maybe Jesus never rows a boat, but you know.
Yeah.
um yeah, so it's interesting that, and I think I think like I guess it's interesting to see how the disciples respond to Jesus, like you said.
Mm,
Like what do the disciples say, or like how do they answer unexpected things, like things that they've never experienced before, or like yeah, I don't know how much. Clearly Jesus doesn't walk on water that often, or else they would have known it was him.
mhm,
um and so it's almost like they rationalize what they didn't understand to
mm,
something that was like, oh, it's a ghost. And that made them fearful. So, yeah, I think there's something interesting about just, how the disciples rationalize what was unexpected.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it kind of relates to the our first deal that we had where I mean the disciples kind of like reacted in like an unexpected way where like they didn't ask Jesus to calm the storm. They were just like, "Hey, God," or like, "Jesus, do you think like we're gonna die? Like, do you care if we die?" And then maybe even here, like they see Jesus like performing this miracle, like walking on water, but they're like, "Oh, it's a ghost!" Like, we're so scared. But yeah, I mean, I also liked how Peter responded specifically. I guess like
Hmm.
maybe at first he did be like, "Oh, it's a ghost," but then he clearly like recognizes that it is God that's walking on water, and
Yeah.
then he like basically calls out to him and asks him um to I guess like allow Peter to even walk on the water and come to Jesus. And I guess I feel like maybe that would be the more appropriate like um response to this, to like whatever's happening. And I mean, I guess like relating it to like my own personal life or like just people in general, I feel like maybe a lot of the times we see like Jesus doing this thing or like asking us to do something, but then our first response is like, "Oh, that's not Jesus," or like, "That's not God like doing that." But then um maybe like our response should be less like the disciples and be like, oh, it's a ghost, or like, oh, it's something that isn't God, but instead be like Peter's, I guess, where
Mm.
he like calls out to God and asks him to like, oh, if it really is you, allow me to take the step forward towards you, instead of like, I guess, being cowardly and running away. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like one unexpected response when the disciples first see Jesus is they say it's a ghost. And then the next unexpected thing, like after Jesus is like, take heart, don't be afraid, is
Hmm.
I think it's like pretty incredible that Peter has like I mean it has to be like he has faith, right?
Yeah.
That if Jesus does command him to go on the water,
Hmm.
that means he really can walk also on water.
Mm.
Um and so I think that's pretty remarkable. Um and I guess as you were talking, it kind of reminds me of, and it's like an unprocessed thought, but I think about it sometimes where like, we talk a lot about like quote unquote spiritual high off of
Mm.
retreat,
Yeah.
where maybe like people enter retreat feeling like they're not very close with God, or they just know that like, oh, my relationship with God could be better, right?
Hmm.
Like some aspect could have more faith. And then by God's grace in retreat, they actually experience like a revival, or they
Hmm.
experience like some sort of like uplifting and like closeness with God. And
Hmm.
then is like a big turning point for like the semester of like, oh, now I'm back on campus, then like I feel like I can do so much,
Hmm.
like I want God wants to use me in these particular ways.
Hmm.
And I just bring that up because I kind of see that paralleled in like what Peter and these disciples are thinking. Like they were fearful of what was unexpected, and they didn't really know that this was Jesus somehow. And then once they found out that, oh, Jesus is walking on water, Peter has this like uh big faith moment of like, ask me to walk on water,
Mm.
and then he does. But then I think what's even more like, it kind of just, what the spiritual high talks about is at some time it's gonna fade,
Yeah.
like it kind of just ends at retreat or maybe a few weeks after.
Hmm.
And I don't know, I think it's interesting in this passage, it's like Peter sees the wind and then he begins to sink. So like as Peter is like, I can walk on the water because God has called me to. And
Hmm.
then he sees something that scares him and he doubts and then he begins to sink. I don't know. It just like, it kind of reminds me of the spiritual high that
Hmm.
maybe people experience.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that reminds me of like I think that relates, that like analogy relates super well to like what's like even after that verse where
Mm,
like Peter starts to sink, and then because, yeah, as you said, because of like he sees the wind, he is afraid and begins to sink. I guess I feel like that can be related to, yeah, when the spiritual high like starts to decline. Like where we like go to retreat, we're like, yes, praise Jesus, like like praise the Lord, everything's great. And then once we get back to school, maybe like, especially when I was in college, I feel like the wind and like everything was like my schoolwork, or like
mm,
my stress on like trying to like get a job, or like trying to do this internship stuff. And like I feel like though, like in the college life, that was like the wind. So then I was like, yes, praise Jesus, but then like all that wind started hitting me, and then I feel like I began to sink. Like we're like praise Jesus, and then next week we're like, oh yeah, Jesus, and then the next
yeah.
week we're just like, oh, I'm so stressed, like, um, but yeah, I feel like the thing that is important to like see here, I see is like Peter says, like, as he's sinking, Lord, save
Mm,
me. Like he cries out to God, like, once again, because he knows that he is sinking, and he knows that like he's like beginning to like fall into the water. So I feel like when maybe like when we're like feeling that way, like at the critical point is to like ask God to like save us too. And then right after, it says Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him. And I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe Jesus will rebuke you a little bit, saying like you have little faith. Why did you doubt? But I mean, the I feel like the point is that even if we are like kind of sinking in our faith, that like we we have the ability to like call out to God and be like, save me, and Jesus like will save us as we
Right.
see here. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. And like going off of that, I think what, I mean, if you imagine the storm and everything that's happening, it feels like pretty frightening, really. But I think, I guess, like one of the comforts is if you just kind of ask the question of like, where is Jesus? Once he comes, right before he's like on the mountain. But like in this scene, it's like, where's Jesus? And Jesus like hasn't really moved, right? Like Jesus walks to the boat and then he invites Peter to come to him. And it's not like Jesus walked away as Peter was like walking to him.
Mm,
Um, and when Peter begins to sink, like Jesus immediately reaches out his hand. So like Jesus is very close. It's
mm.
not like, oh, he took a few steps and then he reached out his hand.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think what you mentioned of like Jesus kind of reaches out his hand first and then he does give like a gentle like,
Yeah.
oh, like you have little faith. But I think it does speak a lot about like who, like Jesus's character in some way of like he does reach out and grab you. um and it's not as much as like I think people often think that God is like judgmental
Mm,
first, or
mm,
like that God is gonna be angry first.
for
But
sure.
actually what we see in this passage is not like Jesus angry, but just Jesus reaching out his hand. So yeah, maybe that's comforting, I don't know, for some of you guys who are
Mhm.
listening. um but I think like just another thing, Josh, when you were talking about like what was the wind in college, I feel like for me, way back then and still now, like I think a wind is like the rejection of people, which I know, I think a lot of you, I have actually heard people who are listening, that is like a wind that definitely dissuades you in many ways. And
Mm,
I personally have experienced it a lot too, in the sense of like I would definitely say like me as somebody coming out of retreat, I always left feeling more inspired to share the gospel with somebody else.
mm,
But I think the place that I experienced like harshest rejection that I didn't anticipate, and it's still something that I think as I think about today, it makes me really hesitant to um, I guess like really begin relationship with people, is actually like Greek life and sorority life in particular, I suppose. Um, yeah, I don't know how much I've shared before, but like uh, one of the things entering college I was really considering was actually joining a sorority. But then as I became a Christian and just like part of my own coming to faith journey, I just realized that maybe sorority life was not going to in some ways help me as like a very young Christian grow in
mm,
my faith. And so I steered away from it. But I think internally somehow, um, I created false notions and concepts of what sorority life was like. And so when I felt very convicted to like not necessarily join a sorority, but like be really good friends with people in particularly the Asian sorority, I was really challenged and felt discouraged when people were like, oh, I don't want to talk to you about that. Or like I would hear that people were like, oh, the tone or like what she's implying is, um, it's like it sounds judgmental. And I think I didn't realize that. And then as I realized that that was true, and like now my sister's in a sorority, so I talk a lot to her about these things. Um, it's just like a place where I realize still, even to this day, like I talk to my sister about it now because she's my sister. But I think when I think about it at BU, I still fear the same rejection that I faced
mm.
back when like I was a sophomore or junior. Um, but yeah, so that to me is like a win, and it continues to be a win to this day, I think.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think, I guess, like the wind and like Jesus calling us to like come to him as he did to Peter, I guess it does relate in the sense where like Jesus calls us to I guess share like his word and like his gospel as you were saying. And like I think a lot of the hard parts of like evangelism, quote unquote, is like I guess just yeah, putting yourself out there and being like able to like know that like yeah, people like will reject you and like
Hmm.
some people will not be interested in like what you're saying. um but yeah, I mean, at least personally, like I sometimes like feel God, like that little like tug or like that little push to like for me to like go and talk to somebody about the gospel, or just straight up, I guess like just literally just go and talk to somebody just in general, I guess. um
Yeah.
but I feel like especially me like being kind of like shy, it's hard for me to like actually go and do that. And
Right.
yeah, I guess that is like that does relate, now that I think about it, to like the fear of rejection, you know, like the fear of like me not either like being good enough to like just like share the gospel, or them just being like, oh yo, who's this like weird guy who's like trying who's like trying to talk to me. um but yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel like just overcoming that fear and like facing that wind is something that yeah, we can all work on. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like this passage is really relevant to like coming into school this year, and maybe just like as we think about, the purpose of IVME and AA, and um, it might feel like all the things that are happening all the things that are happening around us with COVID, or just like some people are online, some people aren't. Like there are people, maybe as people get to school, there are people who like wear their masks, maybe there aren't, like who knows. There's like so many things that could be the wind.
Mm-hmm.
um but I guess something that this passage points to, and I think is also true about just what is God saying for us about IVME and AA, is that like uh, God intends to make himself known to people on campus, whether online or in person. And just because we feel like it'll be difficult doesn't mean that God isn't going to be able to do it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think in some ways, like the invitation that we get from God when he is going to make himself known is like, um, come and do this with me. Uh, but the wind is like all the other things that I've described. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that is something, I guess, like for everyone who's listening to think about, of like how is God inviting you to join in like the I'm going to make myself known, whether online or in person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, think about like what does that mean that he wants you to walk on that water with him. um I don't know. Yeah. Any thoughts?
I mean, yeah, no, that's. I feel like yeah, as you said, like especially during this semester, there's gonna be a lot more fear. I guess of like this wind. On campus, maybe especially for the freshmen that are coming in specifically. Because like
Mm.
I mean, if you guys remember when you guys first came to college, I mean, it must have been like super disorienting. And then imagine like everything being online and there's like being a pandemic. So I mean, I feel like yeah, our like as we are um like part of double A, like how in what ways are we called to I guess walk on this water and be able to I guess share God's love and his like like his steadfastness to to like the newcomers especially. And what fear will you be um willing to like get over to serve
Mm.
that purpose, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think like that's the question for you guys to be reflecting
Mm-hmm.
on. At the end of this video. Yeah, so hopefully, like yesterday, you have already set aside some time to think about what you just heard. And the question that Josh just asked will be on the screen. So hopefully, yeah, you guys can have some good, meaningful conversation with God before our next time together. Uh, Either later today, if that's when you're watching it, or in a couple days if you're watching early. So thanks for joining us for our second podcast thing.
Mm-hmm.
Still don't really have a name, but see you tomorrow.
Yep. See you guys.